Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to English 454. This is lecture number 23 and we have been discussing S.T. Coleridge, and this is the final lecture in the series of Coleridge. We have discussed so far Coleridge's life, his works, his friendship with Wordsworth, and we have discussed how he claimed that he was different from Wordsworth. हमारा focus उसकी poetry से ज़्यादा उसकी critical work पे है, और उसका critical work basically biography literaria के form में हमारे पास है. This is a book on criticism that he has written, and here he tries to explain to us what he thinks poetry is, what according to him are the characteristics of a poet, and what according to him is the purpose and the function of poetry. He also deliberates on this concept of diction. He also tells us what he thinks a good critic is, and he also tells us a lot about imagination and the difference between imagination and fancy, because for him they were two separate things, और उसकी basically सारी theory of poetry जो है वो imagination पे base करती है, because he, like the other romantics, believed that imagination is the essence of all poetry. तो अगर हम इसको थोड़ा सा sum up करें तो हमें पता चलेगा कि कोलरिज ने अभी तक हमें ये बताया है कि पोइट्री जो है it is something that is produced as a state of excitement which gives you immediate pleasure through the medium of beauty. This is his definition of poetry, na? And he has further pondered upon the three different aspects of this definition. What is the state of excitement that you get? The state of excitement you get by observing anything. आपके emotions एक elevated state में चले जाते हैं. जब एक elevated state में चले जाते हैं तो उसके बाद they tend to express themselves, and when they express themselves you get immediate pleasure. Immediate pleasure, according to Coleridge, is the purpose of poetry. And then he tells you that it is not only important to have immediate pleasure, but it is important to have immediate pleasure through the medium of beauty. Presence of beauty is very important here. So his definition of poetry would not be complete unless and until he gives us the definition of beauty. For him, beauty is something that unifies the whole. Beauty is something that is not only a part of a whole, but it is the whole of a big, larger picture. Things come together, and when the things come together they form something beautiful for him. And we also discussed what according to him would be the qualities of a good poet, or the qualities of a good poem for that matter. तो उसके ख्याल में सबसे important quality किसी भी poem में जो है वो है sweetness of versification. For him, every kind of poetry or every kind of poem has to be good only and only if there is a sweetness of versification, because he says that verse or meter, it adds charm to the writing or the metrical composition. It adds pleasure, and this is something that you can be born with only. This is not something that you can acquire. The second thing that he focuses on is that a poet has to be indifferent. It is the aloofness of the poet, aloofness of the writer, aloofness of the creator that attracts the reader towards whatever they're studying. And another thing that he wants to discuss, or another quality that he finds in poetry or poem that is essential, is that there has to be a predominant passion. There has to be something that is above all other things, that is above all kind of emotions, and that is something that's going to make the subject of poetry universal. He not only discusses that, but he also discusses or criticizes what Wordsworth had to say about prose and poetry. We know that Wordsworth ने कहा था कि there is no essential difference between prose and poetry, neither in the language nor in the choice of words, nor in the choice of the subject matter. He begs to differ from Wordsworth here. He says that you can't say that there is no difference between the two, because he says that generally आप अगर किसी philosopher से पूछेंगे कि that if I want to distinguish between two things, how can I do that? He says that a philosopher would distinguish between the two things by considering the purpose behind the two different things. If the purpose is different, if the end they want to achieve is different, then of course they're two different things. He says that purpose of prose is to provide truth, to communicate truth, and purpose of poetry is to convey or communicate or deliver pleasure, that is immediate pleasure. Though when you provide truth, you provide pleasure, ultimate pleasure, but that comes at a delayed stage. That comes ultimately. That's not the immediate thing that you get out of it. So if you consider it from the philosophical point of view, Coldest says they're almost the same thing because they are ultimately reaching at the same end, that is pleasure. But in the case of one, there's immediate pleasure. In the case of other, there is ultimate pleasure. So there is a little difference between the two. He says that you can't say that there is no distinction between the language of poetry and the language of prose, because you have to see what the thing is being written for. जैसे कि आप प्रोज के अंदर भी डिस्टिंक्शन करते हैं, अगर प्रोज भी डिफरेंट पर्पसेस के लिए लिखी जा रही है, आर्ग्यूमेंटेटिव है, एनालिटिकल है, तो हर एक के लिए चॉइस ऑफ वर्ड्स डिफरेंस होगी. इवन कन्वर्सेशन में भी व्हेन यू आर कन्वर्सिंग विद समवन हु इज अ लिटिल ओल्डर देन यू और हु हैज दिस better status than you, or who's in the position of power, you'll be talking to him in a different tone than to the person who's like cleaning your house. You'll talk to your maid in a different tone. Your choice of words would be different. So he says if there is a difference in choice of words when you talk, and there's a difference in the choice of word when you write, so there has to be a difference in choice of word when you write something in prose and something in metrical composition. So he says that you can't outrightly ignore the fact that this difference exists. उसको थोड़ा सा उसने इस चीज़ को भी कंसिडर किया कि Wordsworth was so much against this diction business. He believed that Wordsworth is a little going overboard here. He believed कि आज तक जितनी पोइट्री लिखी गई है, जितनी सेंचुरीज में, जितनी कंट्रीज में आज तक जितने भी पोइट्स गुजरे हैं, they've all made use of these metrical compositions. They've all used diction. And their poetry has stood the test of time. It has flourished, it has survived, and it is still remembered by people and still appreciated by people. So outrightly overruling diction, according to Coleridge, would not be a wise thing to do. He believed that something that has survived so long must have something good in it. So we can't, overrightly, get rid of diction altogether. अच्छा, फिर इसको कोलरिज को थोड़ा सा एक इशू ये भी था वर्ड्सवर्थ के साथ कि ही वांटेड टू से कि वर्ड्सवर्थ ने नेचर पे बहुत ज़्यादा फोकस कर लिया है, एंड वर्ड्सवर्थ क्लेम्स दैट नेचर अलोन कैन ब्रिंग आउट द ट्रू essence of a human being. Nature alone can make the human being worth his soul. So he says it's not nature, it's something that is born, that is present within the person as well. So if the nature is there and the person is lacking that internal quality, that innate goodness or the innate analytical ability, all the nature could be present around him. It could be glorious, it could be glamorous, it could be awakening, but the person who does not want to analyze it, who does not have the sensibility, which Wordsworth calls it the organic sensibility, that person is not going to get anything out of the nature. So nature alone would not be that important according to Coleridge. You can't just say कि इस पे फोकस करके इसको सब्जेक्ट मैटर बना के आप को बहुत बड़ी चीज़ अचीव कर सकते हैं या ह्यूमन बीइंग को यूनिवर्सल ट्रूथ तक पहुंचा सकते हैं. He also is somewhat against whatever Wordsworth has to say about the rustic life and the use of the rustic language. He says that you say that you want to use the real language. The word you should have used should have been that you want to use the ordinary language, because he believes that every language is real language, but it is somehow enveloped in the peculiarities of a particular era or a particular area or a particular geographical location. So if that peculiarity, if that particularity is removed from the language of educated people and the language of the rustics, it's essentially the same. So if you want to say that you want to use the language of the rustic people, you have to use the word ordinary first of all, and secondly you have to use the same sentence structures, the same order that the rustic people do. He says that Wordsworth has chosen the words that the rustic people have used, for example, but he has not chosen the order they use these words in. He has chosen the correct order, that is the grammatical order. So if he has chosen the grammatical order, why does he claim that he has used the rustic language? Because if you have used the rustic language, it would not have made sense. ठीक है? अच्छा, फिर उसको एक एतराज़ वर्ड्सवर्थ ये भी था कि he contradicts himself. He says that he is going to focus on the rustic characters, but he has named a number of Wordsworth poems, and he says कि characters इनके अंदर जो agents हैं, they are by no means rustic characters. They're ordinary people. They can belong to the characters that Wordsworth has portrayed are characters that can belong to any place in the society. They can belong to a city. They can belong to a church. They can be sitting next to you in a train. So whatever Wordsworth says, he's not sticking to it, because the claim that he has made, that focusing poetry on the rustic life and the rustic language and nature, was not strong enough to be carried out. He completely overwhelmed कर लिया उसने Wordsworth को, and he couldn't carry it out. This was as much as he had to say, and we discussed. We are going to discuss his theory of poetry today, and then we're going to sum up Coleridge on the whole. So whatever poetry he discussed, आपने ये याद रखना है कि he was a poet himself, and his poetry was that of a supernatural kind. उसमें एक element आता है supernatural का. He has already explained it. He says कि when he met Wordsworth, इनको lake poets भी कहते हैं, because they met each other in the country, in the Lake District, ठीक है? And when they met each other, they decided. अब ये he says कि I don't remember who started this conversation and who had the idea of the lyrical ballads preface लिखने का, ये romanticism का जो भी चल रहा था era वो पूरा. But he says that we decided that there has to be two classes of poem. One in which the agents and the subject matter, they can be the supernatural ones, and the other is the kind of poems in which the characters and the agents and the themes would be the close to nature from the rustic life. तो कहता है कि Wordsworth ने choose किया कि he is going to write from the second class of poetry, and I chose that I was going to write from the first class of poetry. He believed कि when we discussed all this, we wanted to treat, I expected Wordsworth to treat nature in such a way that it created the same kind of shock and awe and the feeling of anxiety or the flowing of emotions, the kind of emotions that would flow in the case of something supernatural happens. When someone realizes that he or she has been under or has experienced something supernatural. So he himself is stuck to this supernatural element kind of things. He believed कि poetry को ऐसे experience होना चाहिए जो memorable हो और जो बाकी experiences से इंसान को different feel करवाए. So he also उसकी जो poetry की जब आप बात करेंगे तो you have to remember कि he's laying great account with great stock with this imagination. So he says उसके लिए उसने तो पूरी theory of imagination दी हुई है. We don't have much about what he has to say about imagination except for a paragraph, and the paragraph is written in very difficult English. It somehow doesn't make sense when you read it, what Coleridge has written. But the essence of it is that he believes that there are two kind of things, fancy and imagination. Imagination and fancy, they are two different things. They are not one and the same things. They're not the kind of things that people expect them कि एक ही चीज़ के दो नाम हैं या एक ही चीज़ की दो डिग्रीज हैं, एक ज़रा हायर फॉर्म है जैसे सुपरलेटिव फॉर्म है और एक जो है वो दरमियानी सी फॉर्म है, ये रेगुलर फॉर्म है, लोअर फॉर्म है उसकी. कहते हैं two entirely two different things. He believes that imagination in itself is it's basically the essence of creation or the essence of knowledge, the essence of poetry है. He says कि imagination जो है ये दो तरह की होगी. एक होगी primary imagination और दूसरी होगी secondary imagination. Primary imagination, he says, all beings, human beings, are born with primary imagination. It's inbuilt in them. It's the imitation of the creative process that occurred in this universe, which brought order to this chaos of the universe. Similarly, the process of creation is repeated in the minds of the human beings, and the agent is the primary imagination. He says secondary imagination is just an echo of the primary imagination, but it combines with the will. It's a conscious effort in which you combine the echo or a form of imagination to the conscious will, and you create something, that you imitate something. ये जो secondary imagination, this is possessed by artists and creative people. This is a conscious effort that they do. ये process imitation का process है. Fancy, on the other hand, is the process of copying, as he says. Fancy is something that you copy from life. जो चीज़ें already आपको पता थी, जो चीज़ें आपके लिए defined थी, things that were fixated in your life, fixities of your life, things that were present in your life, that were a given, that they're there. आप उसको मॉडिफाई करते हैं, आप उसको इनोवेशन में लेके आते हैं, आप उसके अंदर कोई 4 मोती इधर और 2 सितारे इधर लगा के और एक पर पीछे लगा के उसको खूबसूरत बना के उसको फैंसी कर देते हैं। फैंसी जोड़ा क्या होता है? फैंसी जोड़े में यही होता है ना कि यू ऐड समथिंग टू इट, गोटा तिल्ला लगा के 2-4 वो मोती से लगा के और 2-4 हीरे की तरह की चीजें डायमंड्स लगा के यू मेक समथिंग फैंसी। फैंसी जूतियां भी यही होती हैं। तो बस उससे फैंसी को याद रखिए कि फैंसी इज दैट समथिंग विच वुड क्रिएट विच वुड जस्ट मेक थिंग्स अ लिटिल मोर glamorous, ठीक है, which would modify things. It is just an act of copying. It's not imitation. Imagination is the imitation process. Imagination creative process है. Fancy is just a copying act. ठीक है जी? अच्छा, अब हमने पढ़ना है कि what all he has to say about poetry a little in a little detail. अच्छा, as in the Biographia Literaria, the definition of poetry does not get itself written without the aid of conscious will and understanding. You have to remember that. कि उसने कहा था कि ये जो चीज़ें हैं ना, the theory of imagination, उसने हमें बताया था कि imagination is a very important thing. It's going to bring together the opposites. ठीक है, वो आपके logic को और आपके emotions को इकट्ठा करती है, वो आपके soul को active करती है पूरे इस creative process के अंदर, पूरे के पूरे soul को involve करती है, आपकी सारी faculties को इकट्ठा करती है and make them work in a proper order of एक proper hierarchy develop करती है आपकी सारी faculties की, आपकी सारी काबिलियतों की, आपकी abilities की, ठीक है। तो definition of poetry cannot be written without the aid of conscious will and understanding. So you have to understand the fact of what was imagination, what was secondary imagination, and how do you understand it, how does it take place. So you have to remember the fact that there is this process where the head and the heart, they come in contact and there is a perfect balance between the two. ये balance कौन लेके आएगा? Imagination लेके आएगी. You should have to understand this process. So to the pleasure attached to the poetic emotion or excitement is not merely a sympathy with the object's emotion or incidents contemplated by the poet, but is also the pleasure of the mind in the exhibition of its power for their own sake. अच्छा, अब आपने एक चीज़ याद रखनी है कि हमने ये डिस्कस किया था कि पोएम की सबसे अच्छी क्वालिटीज़ नहीं, अच्छी क्वालिटीज़ में से एक क्वालिटी ये थी कि द पोएट हैज़ टू बी डिसइंटरेस्टेड in the subject matter. He does not have to get involved in it. He does not have to show his partiality. He does not have to be biased. But there is a pleasure there. The pleasure is there in the process of creation. ठीक है? The pleasure attached to the poetic emotion or excitement is not merely a sympathy with the objects, emotion or incidents contemplated by the poet. जो pleasure है, ये जो excitement है, उसको आप सिर्फ ये नहीं कह सकते कि जो भी objects या incidents या जो भी emotions उसने portray किए हैं उनके साथ उसकी कोई sympathy थी, जिनको उसने contemplate किया. Contemplate का process आपको याद है ना कि if anything happened, the poet had to contemplate on these things, on the emotion or the incident, whatever it was. तो उनके साथ जो उसकी sympathetic feeling थी, it's not only the sympathy that is giving rise to this pleasure or the excitement. क्योंकि देखिए, अगर आपको ये एहसास कभी पैदा आपके अंदर भी हुआ हो कि सेल्फ पिटी इन इट सेल्फ इज अ वेरी प्लेजरेबल एक्टिविटी, पिटी, sympathy, you feel good about it. So he says that it is not only the sympathy which is giving the pleasure. When you're contemplating any object or emotion or incident that has created a height of excitement in you and height of emotion in you, you get pleasure out of it. The sympathy is giving you pleasure, but that is not the only thing that is giving you pleasure, but is also the pleasure of the mind. There's a pleasure that you get, that your mind gets. There's a pleasure which is involved in the process of creation. There's a pleasure involved which you will get when you do something creative. ठीक है, जो होता है ना कि जैसे साइंटिस्ट्स के बारे में कहते हैं कि when they discover something, before the discovery there is this process, the entire process of courtship, as you put it. कोर्टशिप का जो प्रोसेस है, उसमें जब उसको वू कर रहा है, उसको कोर्ट कर रहा है, उस फैक्ट को, उस चीज़ को डिस्कवर करने की कोशिश कर रहा है, उसके अंदर जो उस तलाश में या उस प्रोसेस में जो प्लेजर है, दैट इज़ ऑल्सो वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. दैट इज़ द प्लेजर ऑफ माइंड. वो जो उसकी क्या कहते हैं एडिक्शन है, दैट इज़ ओवरवेलमिंग. But it's also the pleasure of the mind in the exhibition of its powers for their own sake. That your mind is capable of creating such a big thing, such a beautiful thing, such a great thing, such a creative act is involved. Your mind is involved in. So this pleasure is very different from the pleasure that you would get from the sympathy only. So the pleasure that you get from poetry is twofold. The poet is going to get the first pleasure when he is going to sympathize, and he's contemplating the emotion or the object or the incident that gave rise to certain feelings on him. He'd have some sympathy for it, and he'd it would give him some sort of pleasure, जो भी process उसके अंदर चल रहा होगा उस वक्त. The second kind of pleasure he would have when he get involved in the process of creation. क्योंकि उसका दिमाग उसमें इस्तेमाल होता है, उसका दिमाग उसमें involve हो जाता है, उसकी logic, उसकी reason उसमें involve हो जाती है, उसकी logic और उसकी reason को satisfaction मिलती है. और ये satisfaction उसको क्यों मिलती है? क्योंकि वो कुछ create कर रहा होता है. And the process of creation in itself is a pleasure. It's a pleasure in itself. It is a pleasure peculiar to poetic, as poetic emotion is peculiar. It's a pleasure that would you get only when you know what poetry is. तो आपने ये भी याद रखना है कि कोलरिज ने पोइट्री को कैसे डिफाइन किया था. आई होप यू रिमेंबर कि कोलरिज ने कहा था कि पोइट्री इज़ नॉट समथिंग दैट इज़ रिलेटेड टू पोएम्स. ठीक है, उसने कहा था कि एक पोएम बहुत लंबी भी हो सकती है, लेकिन उसके अंदर पोइट्री जो है वो बहुत थोड़ी सी होती है. उसकी क्या डेफिनेशन थी पोइट्री की? उसके ख्याल में हर वो चीज़, हर वो प्रोसेस जिसमें क्रिएटिविटी है, जिसमें एक्ट, स्पिरिचुअल एक्ट इन्वॉल्व है, जिसमें आपकी सारी फैकल्टीज इन्वॉल्व हो जाती हैं, जिसमें आपका सोल इन्वॉल्व हो जाता है, दैट इज़ द process of creativity. That is the process of poetry. Poetry is not a narrow term, it's a wide term, जिसमें ये सारी fine arts आ जाती हैं, जिसमें सारी sciences आ जाती हैं, जिसमें सारी philosophies आ जाती हैं. Poem is only a very narrow part of it. It is a pleasure peculiar to poetry, as poetic emotion is peculiar. Just like poetry के लिए एक खास emotion create होता है किसी खास चीज़ से, जैसे वो चीज़ के लिए particular है, इसी तरह ये pleasure भी सिर्फ poetry के लिए particular है. Coleridge said that no man was ever a great poet without being at the same time a profound philosopher. He has to be a sound philosopher. He has to be a competent philosopher. He cannot be called a poet. He cannot be called a great artist unless and until he is a philosopher at the same time. और philosopher क्या है? Thinker है. Thinker कौन है? जिसमें शेक्सपियर की एग्जाम्पल दी थी कि शेक्सपियर ने पहले तो जिंदगी को ऑब्जर्व किया very very keenly. ठीक है, then he meditated and then he produced it and it became a second nature to him. तो जो philosopher होगा, जो poet होगा, उसका philosopher होना इसलिए ज़रूरी है कि Coleridge wants knowledge to be something intuitive. It should be second nature to the poet. For poetry is the blossom and fragrance of all human knowledge, human thoughts, passions, emotions, and language. Poetry is no small thing. It encompasses every kind of knowledge that human beings or human race has to offer. It is based on your thoughts, it is based on your passions, it is based on your emotions, it is based on your language. It encompasses every aspect of human life, starting from the beginning till the end of the time. Poetry is going to rule all kinds of knowledge. यही बात कि वर्ड्सवर्थ ने भी कही और यही बात कोलरिज ने भी कही कि आप पोइट्री को साइंसेस के साथ और फिलॉसफी के साथ और हिस्ट्री के साथ कंपेयर नहीं कर सकते, बिकॉज पोइट्री इज़ फार मोर सुपीरियर दैन दैम. पोइट्री की ये ब्रांचेस हैं आगे, सब में क्रिएटिव प्रोसेस इन्वॉल्व है, सब में सोल्स जो हैं वो इन्वॉल्व हैं, सब में आपकी सारी फैकल्टीज इन्वॉल्व है. पोइट्री इज समथिंग फार मोर सुपीरियर देन these histories and philosophies and sciences. Coleridge stands for the unity of spontaneous and voluntary in poetry. He says that there is something spontaneous in poetry and there has to be something voluntary as well, something that comes naturally and something that you do with an effort. Voluntary, involuntary actions, if you remember, कुछ चीज़ होती है जो आप अपनी will से करते हैं, अपनी मर्जी से करते हैं, अपनी मेहनत से करते हैं. तो वो कोलरिज कह रहे हैं कि there has to be a difference, there has to be a unity in between the two things. कि पोइट्री सिर्फ spontaneous भी नहीं हो सकती और पोइट्री सिर्फ voluntary भी नहीं हो सकती, कि there has to be union of the two, or in other words there has to be a balance between the two. Either it cannot be that either it is spontaneous or it is voluntary, but there has to be union. Spontaneous emotions हो सकते हैं और इन emotions को putting together in some kind of form could be voluntary. Regarding his own poetry he wrote, this is his own words, I feel strongly and think strongly. ठीक है, आई फील वेरी स्ट्रांगली, जो भी इमोशंस हैं, जो भी इंसिडेंट मेरे साथ होता है, आई फील वेरी स्ट्रांगली अबाउट इट, बट आई नॉट ओनली फील बट देन आई थिंक अबाउट इट टू, एंड आई थिंक स्ट्रांगली. But I seldom feel without thinking or think without feeling. He has put the two things together. देखिए, आपने याद रखना है कि कोलरिज का एक बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट एस्पेक्ट उसकी थ्योरी का ये था कि he believed कि there has to be a balance between heart and head. हार्ट जो है वो हेड के बगैर, ये हेड जो है वो हार्ट के बगैर पोइट्री क्रिएट नहीं कर सकता. देयर हैज टू बी अ बैलेंस बिटवीन द टू थिंग्स. ठीक है, देयर वाज अ एज ऑफ रीजन में जब वो कहते थे कि सिर्फ हेड ही है जो रूल करता है, और कुछ पोइट्स जो कहते थे सिर्फ हार्ट है जो रूल करता है. एंड कोलरिज बिलीव्ड कि यू कांट हैव वन विदाउट द अदर. वर्ड्सवर्थ ने भी तो आपको कहा था कि जब पोइट्री क्रिएट होती है तो देयर कम्स अ स्टेज व्हेन यू हैव टू हैव this tranquility of mind, where the mind or the logic or the reason has to play its part. जो वो emotions को incident से detach करता है, images से detach करता है, और फिर आखिर में poetry create होती है. So he also says that there has to be a union of spontaneous and voluntary when you're talking about poetry. He says कि उसकी अपनी poetry में जब वो लिखता है, he writes and he feels very strongly when he's writing, and then he's not only feeling very strongly but he's thinking very strongly as well. प्लीज ये नोट करें कि वो ये कह रहे हैं कि मैं फील कर रहा हूँ, बट मैं फील बहुत स्ट्रांगली कर रहा हूँ. And I think as well, I'm not using my heart only, but I'm using my head also, and I'm using both of them very, very strongly. Hence, but I seldom feel without thinking or think without feeling. Though I'm feeling very strongly and I'm thinking very strongly, but it hardly happens that I think without feeling or feel without thinking. My thinking is an integral part of my feeling, and my feeling and emotions are an integral part of my thinking process. Hence, though my poetry has in general a line of tenderness or passion over it, yet it seldom exhibits unmixed and single tenderness or passion. कह रहा है कि मेरी पोइट्री को आप डिफाइन कर सकते हैं कि इट हैज़ अ जनरल एटीट्यूड, इट लीन्स टुवर्ड्स टेंडरनेस एंड पैशन. ठीक है, बट यू कांट से कि मेरी पोइट्री सिर्फ टेंडरनेस है, और आप ये भी नहीं कह सकते कि मेरी पोइट्री सिर्फ पैशन है. इट इज़ गोइंग टू बी अ यूनियन ऑफ द टू थिंग्स. वही बात जो वो बार बार कर रहे हैं कि इमेजिनेशन आपकी हेड और हार्ट के दरमियान एक बैलेंस लेके आएगी. इमेजिनेशन आपकी थिंकिंग और फीलिंग के दरमियान बैलेंस लेके आएगी. यू कांट फील विदाउट थिंकिंग एंड थिंक विदाउट फीलिंग. आपकी पोइट्री में अगर टेंडरनेस है, जैसे कि कोलरिज कहता है कि उसकी पोइट्री में थी, और आपकी पोइट्री में पैशन भी है, तो पोइट्री इस तरह की होनी चाहिए कि पैशन और टेंडरनेस के दरमियान एक बैलेंस होना चाहिए. ये नहीं होना चाहिए कि पोइट्री इज ऑल अबाउट पैशन और इट्स ऑल अबाउट tenderness. Such a perfect fusion of thought and feeling is not there in Coldest poetry. That's quite rude, but that's what he thought, and that's what other people think. There was no such fusion of tenderness and passion, or head and heart, and thinking and feeling. He believed that, poor soul, but people who have analyzed his poetry after him, or even in his lifetime, they don't think there was this such great a fusion in his poetry. He at least held that such a fusion was essential for great poetry. He noticed, at least आप उसको इस चीज़ का क्रेडिट ज़रूर दे सकते हैं कि उसने ये सोचा कि ये फ्यूजन होनी चाहिए. चाहे वो इसको कैरी आउट नहीं कर सका, चाहे वो इसको अपनी पोइट्री में ट्रांसलेट नहीं कर सका, इस फीलिंग को, इस आइडिया, इस फिलॉसफी को वो अपनी पोइट्री के अंदर ट्रांसमिट नहीं कर सका, लेकिन ही बिलीव्ड दैट दिस हैज़ टू हैपन, एंड दिस इज़ एसेंशियल. दिस फ्यूजन, दिस बैलेंस, दिस यूनियन is important for great poetry. If it is not existing, then great poetry itself cannot exist. He himself was torn between the conflicting planes of dream and sensations, passions and metaphysicals, and altruistic desire. वो बेचारा, उसकी अपनी पोइट्री जो थी ना, conflicting थी. Either it was very plain, or it had a dream-like quality in it, or they were very, sensual, and they were very emotional stanzas in his poetry, or it was metaphysical, or it was all about this desire to have for this spiritual, physical experience. So his poetry was not what he, bichara, poor soul, I feel sorry for him, what he thought it was, but आप उसकी जो बाकी क्वालिटीज़ हैं पोइट्री की उसको इग्नोर नहीं कर सकते। उसने कोशिश पूरी की थी कि वो उस पैशंस में, डिज़ायर्स में, मेटाफिजिकल एलिमेंट और सुपरनैचुरल में ही वांटेड टू ड्रॉ अ बैलेंस सो दैट ये चीज़ें इकट्ठी हों एक ही पोएम के अंदर। ही माइट नॉट हैव बीन सक्सेसफुल बट एट लीस्ट ही हैड द राइट आइडिया। Theory of poetic diction. That's what he has to say about poetic diction. After Wordsworth, let's see what he has to say. He is a romantic as well, but he is against Wordsworth in most of the things. Against नहीं आपको कहना चाहिए, बल्कि आप ये कह सकते हैं कि he contradicts him sometimes, or he has different views. The critic who took part in the debate was Wordsworth's own friend and collaborator, who after a lapse of 17 years took up Wordsworth's theory and analyzed it part by part in Biographia Literaria. So Wordsworth ने जब preface लिखा lyrical ballad का, Coleridge पूरी तरह उसमें involved था. He knew the ideas that he was going to write in it. ठीक है, और उसका जो सेकेंड एडिशन था जो हम पढ़ते हैं जनरली अपने कोर्सेज में, दैट टू उसमें भी कॉलेज का एक नोट एडेड है डिक्शन पे। 17 साल के बाद व्हेन प्रीफेस वाज फर्स्ट पब्लिश्ड, देन ही डिसाइडेड दैट ही डिसएग्रीज विद अ फ्यू थिंग्स एंड ही डिसाइडेड दैट he wants to take it up now. He wants to talk about it and he tore it apart, part by part. उसने वर्ड्सवर्थ की थ्योरी ऑफ डिक्शन की हर एक हिस्से पे अलग अलग बहस की है। ही वांटेड टू टॉक अबाउट पोएटिक डिक्शन। ही सेज कि आप पोएटिक डिक्शन पे बात करके यू हैव नॉट बीन एबल टू क्रिएट मच ऑफ अ चेंज, दो पीपल हैव स्टार्टेड नोटिसिंग दिस एंड दिस ओनली कैन बी सेड to be the achievement that has been there as a result of this preface to the Lyrical Balance. So Coleridge occupies a unique position not only in English but in European criticism as a whole. He represents a suggestive and in some respects challenging attempt to unite the traditional rationalistic values of classicism with the organic vitalism to which the Romantic movement aspired, and the rest of this union upon an ultimate metaphysical base. आपको इस जो पैराग्राफ से आपको कोल्ड्रिज की पूरी फिलॉसफी पता चल जाती है। अब जो वर्ड्सवर्थ था ना, वो तो आउटराइटली क्लासेस को निगेट कर देता था, और वो जो था ही वाज अ ट्रू रोमांटिक एट हार्ट. Coleridge was a little different. He could not let go of classicism completely. He did follow it to some extent because आपको क्योंकि वो डिक्शन के इतना अगेंस्ट नहीं था, वो ये भी नहीं कहता था कि पोइट्री और प्रोज का जो सब्जेक्ट मैटर है, चलो सब्जेक्ट मैटर की बात नहीं करते, लैंग्वेज है वो डिफरेंट होनी चाहिए. He believed कि it has to be different somehow to some extent. He also believed कि there is a difference between prose and poetry. He also believed that there was in his personality, in his poetry, a combination of the traditional values along with the vital values of the romanticism. ठीक है, बट उसने उसको अपनी एक बेस भी प्रोवाइड की, उसने अपना एक एलिमेंट भी डाला उसके अंदर. आप उसको कैटलिस्ट कहें या उसको यूनिफाइंग एजेंट कहें, आपकी मर्जी है. आप उसकी पोइट्री को अगर बहुत पसंद करते हैं तो आप कह सकते हैं कि उसने जो एलिमेंट डाला ये वो एक कैटलिस्ट के तौर पे एक्ट किया एंड ब्यूटीफुल पोइट्री केम आउट. And if you don't think so, आप कह सकते हैं कि it was a unifying agent. He provided this metaphysical base, ठीक है, जो supernatural base थी इसने वो provide की. तो traditionalists और romantics को उसने दोनों जो streams थी वो उसके अंदर मौजूद हैं, लेकिन इन दोनों को इकट्ठा क्या चीज़ कर रही है, supernatural element जो उसकी poetry के अंदर मौजूद था वो इन दोनों चीज़ों को इकट्ठा कर देता. We can now make assessment of Coleridge's contribution to literary criticism. His claim to the title of the greatest English critic is perfectly legitimate, but he also stands amongst the greatest critics of all times. He had been said to play a dual role of Coleridge. The first one is the transcendental philosopher, and the second Coleridge is the genial and cosmopolitan critic passing judgment on art. तो इसको थोड़ा सा प्रोफेटिक भी स्टेचर लोग देते हैं. प्रोफेटिक से मतलब ये है कि प्रॉफिट्स या फिलोसॉफिकल आप समझ लें चलें इसको, कि ही वाज ऑफ दैट काइंड. उसकी लिटरेरी क्रिटिसिज्म की जो कंट्रीब्यूशन है उसके बारे में ये कहा जाता है कि ही वाज वन ऑफ द ग्रेटेस्ट क्रिटिक्स नॉट ओनली इन इंग्लैंड एंड यूरोप बट ऑफ ऑल टाइम्स. उसका रैंक आप एरिस्टोटल के बराबर लेके जाते हैं. एंड आई माई सेल्फ because I have read Aristotle like you have as well, and I've read Coleridge as well, so I can see that he is quite original as Aristotle was. So there is this claim of being the best or the greatest of the English literature critic. It seems quite legitimate. it is believed that his personality has two shades. It has two classes. One of the classes, or the first class, was that of the transcendental philosopher, the spiritual philosopher, who's moralizing and who's telling people what to do and what not to do. And the second Coleridge is that Coleridge who's the great critic who's sitting in a armchair or in a relaxing chair by the fire, smoking his cigar, a cosmopolitan personality, having a scarf and having a dressing gown and all that, and he's passing judgment on art. ठीक है, contemporary से जो art critics होते हैं, modern, up to date, looking intellectual, you can sum up the picture in your mind. So you can't call him to be a completely eccentric, because people generally believe him to be a very good critic. He is claimed to be one of the greatest critics, and I quite agree with it, and I hope you do as well. His work is unique, combination of theory and concrete practice, a building so spacious that many see only parts of it and not the whole of his achievement. होता क्या है कि हम कॉलेज को जब असेस करते हैं तो बेसिकली आपके जो कंटेम्प्रेरीज होते हैं उनको आपके साथ असेस किया जाता है, या आपकी असेसमेंट या आपकी जजमेंट किसी भी राइटर की या पोएट की उसकी कंटेम्प्रेरीज के साथ की जाती है, उसको उनके रेफरेंस में देखा जाता है. कॉलेज वॉज क्वाइट डिफरेंट फ्रॉम द अदर रोमांटिक्स. ठीक है, तो लोग जनरली उसको बिट्स एंड पीसेस में देखते हैं, उसकी कोई पोइट्री उठा के पोइम देख लेते हैं या उसका क्रिटिसिज्म पढ़ लेते हैं. यू हैव टू असेस कोलरिज एज अ होल. यू हैव टू लुक एट हिम एज एन आर्टिस्ट, एज अ फिलोसोफर, एज अ क्रिटिक, एज अ होल, not a very few bits and pieces of his life. ठीक है, so when you observe him as a whole, you find him a very fascinating person. But generally what happens, people उसकी जो जिंदगी को बहुत ज़्यादा अचीवमेंट से भरी हुई नहीं है, जिसको आप वर्ल्डली टर्म्स में अचीवमेंट कहते हैं, सक्सेस कहते हैं, फेम कहते हैं, नाम हासिल करना कहते हैं, वो तो उस बेचारे के पास नहीं था. सो इट इज़ बिकॉज ऑफ दिस रीज़न पीपल जस्ट ऑब्जर्व ओनली पार्ट्स ऑफ इट जो शाइन करते हैं यकदम, एंड पीपल से हाँ देयर इज समथिंग देयर, बट दे डोंट रियलाइज द फुल पोटेंशियल ऑफ द पर्सन. ही इज़ बेसिकली अ प्लेटोनिस्ट इन सर्च ऑफ द वन इन द मैनी. प्लेटोनिक क्या होते हैं? प्लेटोनिक जो प्लेटोनिक लव की एग्जाम्पल अगर आप लें, प्लेटोनिक लव इज़ द लव दैट इज़ विदाउट द physical aspect of it, no sex involved. Okay? So the person who believes in platonic love is the person who's in search of the soulmate. He was that kind of person. He wanted not in search of soulmate, he was in search of the one. He was looking for the perfect thing. He was looking for the perfect answer. He was looking for the perfect philosophy. He was looking for the perfect definition of poetry for that matter. He was looking for the best system of criticism that was there. आपको याद है कि हमने बिल्कुल शुरू में डिस्कस किया था कि he wanted to give, did not want people to did not want to tell people what to write. He wanted to tell them कि वो अपनी सारी faculties को involve करें इस process of creation में. ठीक है, he wanted to have the most definite answer of all. To some scholars of Romanticism, he shows kinship to Aristotle, as in his conception of symbol and character as a fusion of the particular and the general. बिल्कुल वही बात है कि I find him कि he was like Aristotle. Why? Because he combines not only particular and general, but he also combines symbol and character. Symbols and character are not two separate things. The symbol represents the character, and the character is there to be represented by symbol. They are essentially a part of each other. They essentially belong to each other. Similarly, particular and general are there to on the two edges of a seesaw, and they're there to balance each other. So one cannot exist without the other. So he was one of the few people who saw this balance, who saw the need for this balance, and who saw that there has to be this union, this balance between these two things. His thought is distrusted for its seeming eclecticism, whereas others are dismayed by a certain obsessive monotony in it. अच्छा, कुछ लोगों को वो सेंट्रिक लगता था और कुछ लोग कहते थे कि इसकी बातें बहुत बोरिंग हैं, बहुत monotonous हैं. There is detected in Coleridge the sterility of a closed mind and his freedom in handing the great Germans such talk that would not have been permitted in Germany. देखिए जी, जो क्लासेस थे ना जिसमें कांट था, नीत्शे था, जर्मन फिलोसफर्स थे, कोलरिज ने उनकी अच्छी खासी क्लास ली थी और उनको अच्छा खासा उनको क्रिटिसाइज किया था. सो ही वाज वेरी बोल्ड बिकॉज जर्मन्स आर वेरी वेरी स्ट्रॉन्ग हेडेड पीपल एंड दे आर वेरी opinionated, and people generally are afraid of this martial race and this superhuman race, because they wanted to be in their good books, and they are somehow related, the Germans and the Britons, if you are familiar with the history of English language and all. There was this thing in him that कुछ लोग कहते हैं कि his mind was sterile, closed up, ठीक है, conventional है, और कुछ लोग कहते हैं कि he's so revolutionary that he could talk about Germans in such a way that would not have been permitted in Germany. So he was a revolutionary and a traditionalist at the same time. He's a combination of these contradictions, and this is what makes his personality so motivating. So अब जो एक इम्पॉर्टेंट एस्पेक्ट था कोलरिज की, उसका बायोग्राफी लिटरेरिया जिसको हम पढ़ रहे हैं, उसका एक इम्पॉर्टेंट एस्पेक्ट ये था कि उसने वर्ड्सवर्थ पे भी क्रिटिसिज्म लिखा था. उसने वर्ड्सवर्थ की कुछ पोइम्स को डिस्कस किया था और उनके ऊपर उसने डिस्कोर्स किया था. उनकी अब मैंने आपको शुरू में बताया था कि कोलरिज की सबसे जो इम्पॉर्टेंट बात ये थी वो ये थी कि ही यूज्ड टू गिव डिस्क्रिप्टिव क्रिटिसिज्म, लेकिन उसका डिस्क्रिप्टिव क्रिटिसिज्म जो था वो इलिस्ट्रेशन के पर्पस के लिए होता था. ही वांटेड टू इलिस्ट्रेट अ फ्यू फैक्ट्स व्हिच ही डिड, इलिस्ट्रेट अ theory on the basis of the examples that he has given. So Coleridge has analyzed Wordsworth poetry and pointed out certain defects and beauties in it. It's not that he just analyzed it for the sake of finding fault with it. He was illustrating it to make a point, because he said that there was something that Wordsworth have said that are against against his thoughts or against his opinions. So the first defect is the inconsistency of the style. That is what he claimed that Wordsworth did. He was inconsistent. He deviated from what he claimed that he was doing. There was an inconsistency of style, not only theme but in style as well. जो form उसने apply की थी, जो form उसने use की थी, वो inconsistent थी. By this, Coleridge means the sudden and unprepared transition from lines or sentences of peculiar felicity to a style not only unimpassioned but undistinguished. He says कि कभी कभी तो he used to write such good language, ठीक है, sentences they were joyful, they used to jump with life, the words were alive, the philosophy behind the words, it was great and it was impressive. But suddenly from such bright happy sentences he would move on to sentences that were monotonous, sentences without emotion, sentences without passion, sentences that were undistinguished in any way, that could not, that could not and that would not stand out. He sinks too often. मीन्स कि वो बहुत जल्दी, आपको याद होगा कि हमने बिल्कुल सैमुअल जॉनसन में पढ़ा था कि मिल्टन की पे एक फॉल्ट जो निकालता था, जो लोगों ने निकाला था मिल्टन में, कि ही हैज़ दीज लोज, these planes, these flats. So Samuel Johnson ने कहा था कि there cannot be more highs, there cannot be highs without being there some lows as well. So लेकिन Coleridge कहता है कि there were too many lows. He sinks too often. बार बार गिरता है, बार बार अपने स्टाइल को छोड़ देता है, and too abruptly. और ये भी नहीं कि ये हो के भी कंसिस्टेंटली पोएम शुरू से बुरी आ रही है. कभी कभी ऐसा होता है कि पोएम शुरू से अच्छी चल रही हो, यकदम he would change his tone and he would become all impassioned and boring like, and too abruptly to the styles which belong to the second division of language. अब उसने आगे डिविजन्स ऑफ लैंग्वेज भी बता दिए कि एक तो लैंग्वेज वो होती है जो सिर्फ और सिर्फ प्रोज के लिए होती है, एक लैंग्वेज होती है जो सिर्फ और सिर्फ पोइट्री के लिए होती है, और एक लैंग्वेज होती है जो पोइट्री और प्रोज दोनों के लिए होती है. तो उसने कहा है कि वो आमतौर पे तो वो अच्छी लैंग्वेज यूज़ करता था, लेकिन यकदम उसका स्टाइल जो है वो मोनोटोनस और बोरिंग हो जाता था, एंड देन ही यूज लैंग्वेज दैट फॉर द सेक ऑफ जस्ट कन्वेइंग आइडियाज़ इन पोइट्री. जो पोइम्स में वर्सिफिकेशन में लैंग्वेज यूज़ होती है, इट डिडंट हैव द पैशन बिहाइंड इट. The second defect is a matter of factness in certain poems. This defect may further be divided into categories. उसने कहा कि वर्ड्सवर्थ की पोएम्स में there was a matter of factness. ठीक है, अब ये कितने मज़े की टर्म है कि उसने कहा है कि मैटर ऑफ फैक्टनेस क्या होती है. जब हम यूज़ करते हैं ना ये टर्म एज अ मैटर ऑफ फैक्ट, यानी कि ये सच्चाई है, दिस इज़ व्हाट इट इज़, दिस इज़ टेक इट और लीव इट. ठीक है, कि दिस इज़ ब्लैक एंड वाइट, दिस इज़ 2 + 2 = 4 एज अ मैटर ऑफ फैक्ट, 2 + 2 = 4. सो उसने कहा कि उसकी पोएम्स में ये मैटर ऑफ फैक्टनेस है, एंड दिस डिफेक्ट may be further divided into categories. Number 1, a laborious minuteness in the representation of object in the position as they appear to the poet himself. कहता है कि उसने जो भी ऑब्जेक्ट्स की रिप्रेजेंटेशन की है, जैसे हमारे पास तो 3-4 एग्जांपल्स हैं क्योंकि ये पोएम्स आपने पढ़ी हुई होंगी, जैसे सॉलिटरी रीपर है जो क्लाउड्स के बारे में इसने लिखी है, डैफोडिल्स के बारे में लिखी है. इन सारी पोएम्स में इट इज दे जस्ट सिंपल रिप्रेजेंटेशन ऑफ ऑब्जेक्ट एंड इट इज मोनोटोनस. उसकी वो दिस दिस लेबोरियस माइन्यूटनेस, बिल्कुल बारीकी से, इतनी ज़्यादा मेहनत कि आपको लगता है कि बड़ी कोई एफर्ट से कोई चीज़ लिखी जा रही है. आपको लेबर उसके पीछे फील हो रही है, उसके पीछे मेहनत फील हो रही है, उसके पीछे जो जोर लगाया जा रहा है आपको वो फील हो रहा है. और उसकी पोजीशन और उन ऑब्जेक्ट्स की रिप्रेजेंटेशन एज दे अपेयर टू द पोएट हिमसेल्फ, जैसे वो उनको देख रहा है, जैसे उसके सामने वो चीज़ें आ रही हैं. Number 2, the insertion of accidental circumstances in order to explain fully his living characters, their disposition and actions. अच्छा, फिर उसके बाद वो बहुत ज़्यादा circumstantial कर देता है चीज़ों को. He needs to explain the context somehow, and this, according to Coleridge, was one of the greatest effects in Wordsworth. He needed to explain the circumstances in order to explain his characters and their idiosyncrasies, their dispositions. Why were they sad? If they were sad, why were they sad? जैसे सॉलिटरी रीपर के बारे में कहते हैं ना कि वो गाना गा रही थी, तो उसकी explanation भी साथ दे देता है. क्यों देता है भी explanation? This should have been left to the reader, क्योंकि ये देखिए ना, कॉलेज का बेसिक पॉइंट ही ये है कि there has to be, the writer has to be disinterested, has to stay aloof. अगर आप अपना ही व्यू पॉइंट दिए जा रहे हैं तो यू नॉट अ गुड पोएट, बिकॉज अ गुड पोएट उसकी क्वालिटी ये है कि वो जो उसकी स्टेट ऑफ माइंड है वो एग्जैक्टली रिप्रोड्यूस कर दे अपने वर्ड्स के जरिए अपने रीडर्स के अंदर. अगर वो ये करने में कामयाब नहीं हो रहा तो ही इज़ नॉट अ गुड पोएट. इफ़ ही हैज़ टू क्रिएट सर्टन एटमॉस्फेयर, कुछ सर्कमस्टेंसेस एक्सप्लेन कर करके और उनके एक्शंस और उनके डिस्पोजिशन और उनके इंसिडेंट्स को एक्सप्लेन करके वो अपनी फीलिंग्स वहाँ तक पहुँचाने की कोशिश करे, तो ही इज़ नॉट बीन वेरी सक्सेसफुल. The third defect is an undue predilection for the dramatic form from which one or other of the two evils result. Either the thoughts and diction are different from of the poet and they are the same and the indistinguishable. अच्छा, जब आप बहुत ज़्यादा ड्रामेटिक चीज़ क्रिएट करने की कोशिश करें तो जो कैरेक्टर्स की डिक्शन और थॉट है वो पोएट से डिफरेंट हो जाएगी बिल्कुल, ठीक है, या फिर वो बिल्कुल पोएट जैसी हो जाएगी. So this, according to Coleridge, is a defect. The fourth defect consists of occasional prolixity, repetition instead of progression of thought. He repeats the same kind of thing. There's no progress of thought, there's no progress of philosophy in Wordsworth. He is just repeating the same thing, nature, 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 rustic life. The fifth defect is that there are thoughts and images too great for the subject. This is an approximation to what might be called a mental bombardment as distinguished from the verbal. He says कि जो subject जिससे वो deal कर रहा है, जिसके through वो कोई चीज़ बताने की कोशिश कर रहे हैं, उसमें जो thoughts और images वो डाल देता है उस character के अंदर, उस subject के लिए, वो thoughts या वो images जो वो present कर रहा है अपनी poetry के ज़रिए, these thoughts and images are a little too great for the subject he is presenting. So आपको लगता है कि कोई आप पे ज़बरदस्ती ठोंस रहा है चीज़ें, कोई आप पे ज़बरदस्ती ये फ़िलासफ़ी ठोंस रहा है, आपके दिमाग पे बमबारी की जा रही है फ़िलासफ़ीज़ की, जस्ट लाइक जो हैवी या स्कॉलरली लैंग्वेज होती है वो आपको लगता है ना कि दैट्स अ वर्बल ऑनस्लॉट इन यू. सिमिलरली दिस, अकॉर्डिंग टू कोलेज, हैव गिविंग सच ग्रेट थॉट्स, सच ग्रेट आइडियाज़ टू वेरी सिंपल सब्जेक्ट, इतनी बड़ी बड़ी फ़िलासफ़ीज़ को एक्सप्लेन करना किसी सिंपल सब्जेक्ट के थ्रू, ये इट इज़ अ फॉर्म ऑफ मेंटल bombardment. These defects are counterbalanced by certain beauties in Wordsworth poetry. अब Wordsworth को वो सिर्फ बुरा नहीं कह रहा बल्कि वो कह रहा है कि Wordsworth में कुछ अच्छी चीज़ें भी थी, उसकी एक्सेलेंसेस पे भी वो बात करेगा. तो पहली एक्सेलेंस जो उसके ख्याल में Wordsworth में थी वो थी a purity of language. There was a purity of language and he appreciates that. The purity of language existed both grammatically and logically. The language was logical, I mean it suited the subject, and it was grammatical, of course, correct थी. In short, a perfect appropriateness of words to the meanings. Words were used and the words were used so appropriately that they conveyed the meaning exactly. What the poet wanted to say, the language, the choice of word, the diction, or whatever you want to call it, it was so perfect that it conveyed the meaning exactly, most appropriately. This is one of the first excellences that you find in Wordsworth. the weight and sanity of thoughts and sentiments were not from the books but from the poet's own meditative imagination. अच्छा, जो उसने बातें की हैं, जो उसके sentiments हैं, जो उसकी reason है, जो उसकी philosophy है, जो उसकी wording है, ये जो चीज़ वो आपको बताना चाह रहे हैं, they're not something that you get from the book. It's not copied, it's not borrowed. ठीक है? He is giving Wordsworth the credit of originality. He's telling people that Wordsworth was very much original. His thoughts was his own. There was nothing borrowed. There was nothing on lent here. ठीक है? तो उसने कहा कि उसके thoughts और उसके sentiments, उसके emotions और passions, they were not borrowed from the book or not from anyone either. They were genuine and they were based on his meditative imagination. This was something that he himself imagined. उसकी imagination इसमें involved थी, उसका thinking process, उसकी contemplation, उसकी meditation, सब कुछ इसके अंदर involved था और उसने उसको ये sentiments और ये thoughts दिए हैं. The sinewy strength and originality of single lines and paragraphs. Even the severest critics of Wordsworth have been compelled to acknowledge this quality of his poetry. उसकी stanzas, lines, paragraphs, जैसे कि उसने preface to the Lyrical Balance में किए हैं, they're sinewy, perfectly created, very beautiful, very precise, compact, tiny, beautiful, well-constructed sentences and lyrics, whatever, single lines है, चाहे वो एक poem की line है या जो कुछ भी, तो उसके बहुत अच्छे जो critics हैं जो कि वर्ड्सवर्थ को बिल्कुल पसंद नहीं करते, जिसको बहुत ज़्यादा criticize करते हैं, they also have to give him the credit of construction. He has written beautiful lines in English language. Another beauty is the perfect truth of nature in his images and description, as taken immediately from nature and proving a long intimacy with the very spirit which gives expression to all the works of nature. यहाँ पर उसने इसका appreciate किया. Remember कि he has criticized him for focusing too much on nature, but here he is appreciating the fact that whatever he has written it most originally. He is not borrowing anything from anyone. He is convinced, Wordsworth is, whatever he is writing, he is convinced of it. तो जो उसकी, चूँकि वो लिख अपनी अंदर से रहा था, क्योंकि emotions heartfelt थे, इसलिए whatever he was writing was evident in what he was writing. There was a perfect truth of nature which was evident in whatever he was writing. जो वो images nature के देता था, जो वो description देता था nature की, उसके अंदर you can see the truth. And the truth was there. Why? Because it was based on observation. It came from this close association that Wordsworth had with nature. It was not, some, a sort of a teenage fever. It was not a temporary obsession that he did, that one day he got up and he decided that he's going to write about nature. It was a lifelong companionship, a lifelong interest in nature, which found its way in poetry. So, वो जो उसकी lifelong association थी nature के साथ, जो उसका interest था nature में, it became evident in his poetry. You could see the truth in it. It was not something made up. It was not something written for the sake of writing it. It was what he meant. It was what he thought of it originally. There was a long intimacy. उस intimacy के result में, there was the spirit of nature could be seen in his poetry as well. The spirit of nature that comes into anything which is true, anything that is in the essence, the truth of knowledge, which comes in all the works of nature. जिस तरह फूल खूबसूरत है, there's a spirit in flower, the spirit of beauty in flower. Like there's a spirit of beauty in a beautiful tree. There's a spirit of beauty in a blade of grass. वो जो spirit है, जो सारी nature का हिस्सा है, जो सारी nature को खूबसूरत बनाता है, वही spirit Wordsworth की poetry के अंदर भी आ जाता है. The fifth excellence is a meditative pathos, a union of deep and subtle thoughts with sensibility, a sympathy with the man as man, but sympathy of a contemplator rather than a fellow sufferer. He was a man, he contemplated the suffering of man, but not as a fellow sufferer, but as a contemplator, as a philosopher, someone who's observing other men. He was a man, so he could feel for them, but he was not suffering with them, but he was standing aloof, observing them. There is this union of deep and subtle thoughts. Men are there to observe whatever Wordsworth had to say, and he had to say what other men were feeling, but his feelings, he kept them different from what he was feeling himself.
उसकी थॉट्स जो थी वो डीप भी थी और सटल भी थी, लेकिन उनको उसने मिला दिया सिंपैथी के साथ, सेंसिबिलिटी के साथ, एंड द सिंपैथी ही हैड फॉर अदर men as fellow human beings, but he was not a sufferer in this process. The sixth excellence is the gift of imagination. In the highest and the strictest sense of the word, he is giving him the credit that he made use of imagination. Or imagination, Coleridge ke khayal mein, was the essence of all poetry. That was the basis of all poetry. In imaginative power, he stands nearest of all modern writers to Shakespeare and Milton. He gives him the credit of being or ranking him with Shakespeare and Milton, but in a kind, perfectly unborrowed and his own. It was not something that he has borrowed from anyone. He was a different class. He was a class apart. He was a different category. You can't categorize him with Shakespeare and Milton. You can say that he was as great a poet, as great an artist as Shakespeare or Milton was, but he has a class of his own. His class is as great as equal to that of Milton and Shakespeare. So the sixth excellence would be the gift of imagination, and the imagination made him such a great artist, it gave it such a strictest sense of wonder and gave it such truth that he reached these heights of grandeur. Let's sum up what we did today, and that would be the end of Coleridge. The next person we're going to do, the next critic we're going to study would be Matthew Arnold, and he's one of the Victorian poets. And he's a critic as well. वो romantics में हम उसको consider करते हैं, because उसने जब अपनी poetry start की थी तो उसने romanticism पे ही start की थी, but then he changed. He was a turncoat and he decided that he wants to be a traditionalist, a classicist for that matter. अच्छा जी, तो आज जो चीज़ें हमने पढ़ी हैं उसमें सबसे पहले हमने इसकी theory of poetry पढ़ी है, what he thought poetry was. So उसने definition of poetry दी है जो कि हमने पहले भी पढ़ी थी, और definition में उसने कहा था कि there has to be a sense of excitement which give rise to immediate pleasure and which would be delivered to or delivered through a medium of beauty. ठीक है, उसने कहा था कि poetry cannot be defined without this union between understanding and conscious will, and the pleasure that is attached to the poetic emotion is not merely derived from the sympathy that arises, but it's also attached. The pleasure also comes from the process of creation. Your mind gets pleasure when it is involved in this process of creation. ठीक है, he said कि कोई भी artist या कोई भी poet जो है वो तब तक great poet नहीं हो सकता, अच्छा poet नहीं हो सकता, जब तक कि वो एक profound philosopher नहीं है, जब तक कि वो एक thinker नहीं है. और इसने शेक्सपियर की एग्जाम्पल दी थी कि शेक्सपियर वेंट थ्रू दिस प्रोसेस ऑफ ऑब्जर्वेशन एंड थिंकिंग एंड रीथिंकिंग एंड कॉन्टेम्पलेटिंग, एंड देन knowledge became his second nature. Coleridge stand that a poetry has to be a union between spontaneous and voluntary. There has to be this balance. He says that I feel very strongly and I think very strongly, and there is a balance between these two things, because I never think without feeling and I never feel without thinking. So he says there's this line of tenderness in my poetry and there's a line of passion in my poetry, but there is a union of both. My poetry is never tender only or passionate only. But the critics, they do not agree with him here. They say that this is not essentially true for his poetry, but they do give him the credit that, of course, he had the idea, he had the right idea, he knew where to start. There were certain conflicting planes of dreams, sensations, passions, and metaphysical and holistic desires in his poetry. They do give him the credit of that. So उसकी poetic diction की theory Wordsworth की poetic diction से थोड़ी सी different है. वो कहता है कि the critic who took part in the debate, he acted as a critic है, वो Wordsworth का friend नहीं है यहाँ पे, और उसने Wordsworth की theory of diction को part by part discuss किया है. He says कि उसके ख्याल में कि जो चीज़ इतने सदियों से इतने सारे poets और इतने सारे writers follow करते आ रहे हैं, it has to make sense somehow. So you can't outrightly ignore it and let go of it. it. So he is one of the greatest critics. Why? Because he is supposedly original. He is giving you something new. He is a thinker, he is a philosopher, he is a moralist, but he's not, you know, doing it for the sake of doing it. He's trying to make sense here. So उसको आमतौर पे अरिस्टोटल के बराबर का क्लेम किया जाता है. उसकी जो क्रिटिसिज्म है उसमें ट्रेडिशनल एलिमेंट भी है, उसमें रोमांटिक्स की वाइटलिज्म भी है, और ये दोनों चीज़ें जो हैं, दिस ट्रेडिशनल एलिमेंट एंड द रोमांटिक एलिमेंट, दे हैव दिस बेस जो उन दोनों को इकट्ठा करते हैं. दैट इज द मेटाफिजिकल बेस और द सुपर नेचुरल बेस दैट कोलरिज हैड इन हिज पोइट्री एज वेल एज इन हिज पर्सनैलिटी. सो उसकी जो लिटरेरी क्रिटिसिज्म में कॉन्ट्रीब्यूशन है, उसके हिसाब से तो उसको कहा जाता है कि इज वन ऑफ द ग्रेटेस्ट English critics. And why we say it? Because he is sometime, you know, this transcendental philosopher, and in the next moment he's this contemporary critic who's sitting in a cosmopolitan city, and he's commenting or passing judgment on art. There's a unique combination of theory and concrete practice in him. ठीक है, वो खाली थेरी नहीं दे रहा बल्कि उस थेरी को एक्ट आउट करके उसको प्रैक्टिस करके भी आपको दिखा रहा है. उसकी जो पर्सनालिटी है, उसका काम है, इट इज़ सो वर्सटाइल दैट पीपल फेल टू एप्रिशिएट हिम फुली. He is the person who's in search of the perfect thing, perfect answer. So there is a fusion in his personality, in his work, of a symbol and a character, and that of the particular and the general. His thoughts is distrusted for his seeming eclecticism. Some people consider him to be a radical. The other consider him to be a very monotonous person. So every person, some person consider him as a closed mind, a traditionalist, and some people consider him to be a revolutionist. So it changes from person to person basically. अब उसके बाद हमने आज कॉलेज ऑफ वर्ड्सवर्थ के रिलेशन को भी डिस्कस किया है कि how he has criticized वर्ड्सवर्थ. तो उसने वर्ड्सवर्थ के कुछ फॉल्ट्स निकाले हैं, जिसमें पहला फॉल्ट ये था कि उसके ख्याल में कि देयर वाज एन इनकंसिस्टेंसी ऑफ स्टाइल. ठीक है, यकदम बहुत ज़्यादा हैप्पी और पैशनेट सेंटेंसेस लिखते लिखते अकॉर्डिंग टू कॉलेज वर्ड्सवर्थ फॉल्स, एंड ही फॉल्स और सिंग्स टू ऑफन. ही चेंजेस टू सेंटेंसेस दैट वर मोनोटोनस एंड दैट वाज बोरिंग, दैट वर, you know, passionless. The second defect was this matter of factness that Wordsworth had. This defect उसने further divide किया है कि उसकी जो यानी कि बहुत ज़्यादा डिटेल में वो चीज़ों को जिनको ऑब्जर्व कर रहा है, इंसिडेंट्स को, ऑब्जेक्ट्स को बहुत ज़्यादा डिटेल में बताता है. फिर वो जो सर्कमस्टांसेस हैं, ये जो थॉट्स हैं एसोसिएटेड उन कैरेक्टर्स के साथ, उन कैरेक्टर्स की यानी कि एजेंट्स के कैरेक्टर्स को एक्सप्लेन करने के लिए वो उन सर्कमस्टांसेस को ऐड कर देता है पोइम्स को. जो तीसरी चीज़ उसके अंदर वो डाल रहा है वो अनड्यू प्रेडिक्शन फॉर द ड्रामेटिक फॉर्म फ्रॉम विच वन और अदर ऑफ द टू इवल्स रिजल्ट. वो बहुत ज़्यादा ड्रामेटिक फॉर्म यूज़ करता है. ज़्यादा होता है ना कि सडन एक एटमॉस्फेयर, ड्रामेटिक एटमॉस्फेयर क्रिएट करने की कोशिश करता है. तो उसके ख्याल में थॉट और डिक्शन जो है वो उसके लिए डिफरेंट होनी चाहिए ड्रामा के लिए. और इस केस में ये इशू होता है कि पोइट की थॉट और डिक्शन किसी और डायरेक्शन में जा रही होती है, जो कैरेक्टर्स है उनकी थॉट और डिक्शन जो है किसी और डायरेक्शन में जा रही होती है. The fourth defect is occasional prolixity, that is repetition instead of progression of thought. उसकी thought जो है वो stagnant रह रही है, वो grow नहीं कर रही है, further उसमें increase नहीं आ रही. और जो fifth defect is that their thoughts and images too great for the subject. आपको लगता है कि you are being mentally bombarded with information and ideas and philosophies. उसके अलावा फिर उसने खाली डिफेक्ट्स नहीं निकाले, उसकी एक्सेलेंसेस या उसकी खूबियों को भी गिनवाया है. पहली चीज़ जो उसने गिनवाई है वो आपकी है कि उसकी लैंग्वेज वर्ड्सवर्थ की इट वाज एक्सेलेंट, ग्रामेटिकल, लॉजिकल एंड अप्रोप्रिएट फॉर द वर्ड्स, अप्रोप्रिएट फॉर द मीनिंग इट वांटेड टू कन्वे. वेट एंड सैनिटी ऑफ थॉट्स एंड सेंटिमेंट्स. जो भी उसने कहा, जो भी उसके सेंटिमेंट्स थे, जो भी उसकी थॉट्स थी, दे वर नॉट borrowed फ्रॉम द बुक्स बट दे वर हिज ओन. उसकी जो मेडिटेशन थी, उसकी ऑब्जर्वेशन थी, उसका रिजल्ट थे. अच्छा, उसके जो सेंटेंसेस थे दे वर कॉम्पैक्ट, प्रीसाइज, वेरी वेल कंस्ट्रक्टेड. और उसके जो सिवियरेस्ट क्रिटिक्स हैं वर्ड्सवर्थ के, वो भी उसको वेल कंस्ट्रक्टेड सेंटेंसेस का क्रेडिट देते हैं. जो उसकी एक और ब्यूटी थी वो ये थी कि नेचर वॉज नॉट समथिंग दैट ही वॉज डूइंग इट डिस्कसिंग फॉर द सेक ऑफ डिस्कसिंग इट. इट वॉज द इमेजेस और जो डिस्क्रिप्शन उसने ली है दे वर टेकन डायरेक्टली फ्रॉम द नेचर. और ही हैज़ दिस क्लोज इंटीमेसी विद नेचर एंड दिस क्लोज इंटीमेसी इज शोन इन द डिस्क्रिप्शन ऑफ नेचर दैट ही इज गिवन. द स्पिरिट ऑफ नेचर इज एविडेंट इन हिज पोएम्स एज वेल. The fifth excellence of Wordsworth is this: there's the meditative pathos and the union of deep and subtle thoughts. There's depth and there is subtlety. There is sensibility and there is emotion. He is feeling sympathy for other men because he's a man, but he's a contemplator and not a fellow sufferer. And the sixth excellence is the gift of imagination, which according to Coleridge was the greatest. And this gift of imagination brings him to stand near to Shakespeare and Milton, but in a category of his own. So this is about all, and we'll discuss Matthew Arnold in the next lecture. Thank you very much.